The whistle of the approaching train pierced the quiet afternoon air as Julia Mason stared out the window of the railcar, her heart pounding against her ribcage. The vast landscape of Idaho Territory stretched before her, wild and untamed, so different from the crowded streets of Boston she'd left behind. It was 1885, and at 22 years old, she was about to meet the man she'd agreed to marry through a series of carefully penned letters, a stranger who now waited for her at Chailly Station. Julia smoothed the wrinkles from her navy traveling dress, her fingers trembling. The train lurched as it began to slow, and the knot in her stomach tightened. This was a mistake. All of it the advertisements she'd answered in the newspaper, the correspondence with Matthew Cole, the promise to become his wife and help manage his cattle ranch outside of Chailly's. What had she been thinking? The other women in the car, 3 of them, also mail-order brides, chatted excitedly, but Julia couldn't share their enthusiasm anymore. As the train pulled into the station, she caught sight of a cluster of men standing on the platform. Her eyes immediately found him tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn Stetson that shadowed piercing eyes. Matthew Cole stood apart from the others, just as she'd imagined him from his letters. But as the train shuddered to a stop, panic seized her. This wasn't what she wanted. She couldn't marry a man she'd never met, live in this wild country so far from everything familiar. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself, clutching her small valise with white knuckles. The porter opened the door, and the other women began gathering their belongings. Julia remained frozen in her seat, watching as one by one they descended to meet their future husbands. Matthew Cole stepped forward, scanning the faces of the women. When none approached him, his expression darkened. He climbed the steps into the railcar, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Julia shrank back as his tall frame filled the doorway of the nearly empty car. "Miss Mason." His voice was deep, with a slight drawl that hadn't been evident in his letters. Julia nodded, unable to find her voice. "I'm Matthew Cole." He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His face was weathered from the sun, but his features were handsome, strong jaw, straight nose, and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Are you ready to disembark?" Julia swallowed hard. "Mr. Cole, I've made a terrible mistake. I don't think I can do this after all." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. "I see." "I'm sorry," she continued, words tumbling out. "I thought I was prepared, but this place, it's all so different. I don't belong here." The whistle blew, signaling the train would soon depart. Matthew glanced out the window, then back at her, his jaw set. "Then don't get off the train," he said simply. Julia blinked in surprise. "What? If you've changed your mind, then stay on the train. It continues to Boise, I believe." His voice was controlled, betraying no emotion. "I won't force a woman to marry me who doesn't want to be here." Something about his quiet dignity made her hesitate. This wasn't what she'd expected. The conductor called out, "All aboard." Matthew put his hat back on. "Goodbye, Miss Mason." "I wish you well." He turned to leave. "Wait," Julia said, not sure why she was stopping him. I'm afraid." He paused, looking back at her. "Everyone who comes west is afraid at first. Fear isn't always wrong." The train whistle blew again, more insistently. "Last call." The conductor shouted. Julia's mind raced. Return to Boston. To what? An empty apartment, dwindling savings, and the stigma of being a spinster teacher who had lost her position when the school closed. At least here she had a chance at something new. "Tell me one thing," she said quickly. "Why did you want a mail-order bride?" A muscle twitched in his cheek. "I have a ranch that needs tending, Miss Mason, and a life that's grown too solitary." It wasn't a declaration of romantic intention, but it was honest. Something about his straightforward answer steadied her. "If I stay," she said slowly, "and things don't work between us, then I'll ensure you have the means to leave," he replied. "I'm not in the business of keeping anyone prisoner." The train began to move. Julia felt the slight jerk beneath her feet. "Make your choice," Matthew said quietly. In that moment, looking into the eyes of this stranger who might become her husband, Julia made her decision. She stood and grabbed her valise. Matthew's hand, calloused and strong, reached out to steady her as the train gathered momentum. Together they jumped down onto the platform, Julia stumbling slightly as her boots hit the wooden planks. The train pulled away behind them, taking with it her easy escape. "Welcome to Challies," Matthew said, not letting go of her elbow until he was certain she had her balance. Julia took a deep breath of the mountain air, looking around at the small frontier town spread before her. Wooden buildings lined the dusty main street, and in the distance, mountains rose against the clear blue sky. Nothing like Boston, nothing like anything she'd ever known. "Thank you," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was thanking him for. Matthew picked up her trunk that had been unloaded from the baggage car. "My wagon's this way. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch." As Julia followed him through the station, she noticed the curious glances from townspeople. Clearly, everyone knew who she was and why she'd come. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment. "You almost left," Matthew said when they reached his wagon. It wasn't a question. Julia nodded. "I did." "Why did you stay?" She considered the question carefully. "Because running away seemed more frightening than staying to face the unknown." She looked up at him. "And because you didn't try to convince me, you let it be my choice." Something in his expression softened. "It will always be your choice, Miss Mason. I promised that in my letters, and I mean to keep my word." "Then I suppose we should start over." She extended her hand. "I'm Julia Mason, Mr. Cole. It's nice to finally meet you in person." He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Matthew." "Please call me Matthew. And I'm Julia." "Well, Julia," he said, helping her up onto the wagon seat, "let's get you home before dark." As the wagon pulled away from Challies, Julia wasn't sure if she'd made the right decision or a terrible mistake. But looking at the man beside her, this stranger who had offered her a choice when she'd been ready to flee, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The wagon bumped along the rutted dirt road, carrying Julia further away from the life she'd known. Matthew handled the horses with quiet confidence, occasionally pointing out landmarks or sharing bits of information about the area. The landscape was breathtaking, rolling hills giving way to mountains in the distance, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across meadows dotted with wildflowers. "How long have you lived here?" Julia asked, breaking the slightly awkward silence that had fallen between them. 7 years, Matthew replied, his eyes on the road ahead. "Came out from Missouri after the war with not much more than the clothes on my back and enough money to stake a claim." "And now you have a ranch." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "The Double C isn't the biggest spread around, but it's mine. 200 head of cattle, decent grazing land, and a house I built with my own hands." Julia studied his profile, noting the quiet pride in his voice. "That's impressive. It's a good life, though not an easy one." He glanced her way. "I tried to be honest about that in my letters." "You were," she assured him. I suppose I didn't fully comprehend what it would mean until I saw this place for myself." Matthew nodded. "It's different from Boston. Very different." Julia watched a hawk circle overhead. "In Boston, everything feels confined, buildings pressed together, people everywhere. Out here, there's so much space." "Some find that space liberating," Matthew said. "Others find it lonely." "And you?" He considered the question. "Both, at times." The wagon crested a hill, and Matthew pulled the horses to a stop. "There it is." Julia followed his gaze to the valley below. A modest but well-built ranch house stood near a creek, surrounded by several outbuildings. Beyond it stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed. A large barn painted red stood in stark contrast to the browns and greens of the landscape. "The Double C," Matthew said, a note of pride in his voice. It was smaller than she'd imagined, yet somehow more real than the grand ranch she'd pictured in her mind. This was a home someone had built with care, not a mansion, but a place where a life could be made. "It's lovely," she said softly, and meant it. Matthew seemed pleased by her reaction. He clicked to the horses, and they continued down the slope toward the ranch. As they approached, Julia noticed a figure emerge from one of the outbuildings, a man with graying hair who waved at the wagon. "That's Jasper," Matthew explained. "He helps with the ranch. Been with me almost from the beginning. Does anyone else work here? A couple of cowboys during calving and roundup seasons, but it's mostly just Jasper and me." Matthew guided the wagon into the yard. "And now you, if you decide to stay." The reminder of her uncertain status hung between them as Matthew brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Jasper approached, removing his hat as he reached them. "Afternoon, boss," he said before turning his attention to Julia. "Madam, it's a pleasure to meet you." "Julia, this is Jasper Wilkins," Matthew said as he helped her down from the wagon. "Jasper, Miss Julia Mason." "Welcome to the Double C, Miss Mason," Jasper said with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "We've been looking forward to your arrival." "Thank you, Mr. Wilkins." "Just Jasper, madam. Everyone calls me Jasper." Matthew picked up her trunk. "I'll show you the house." Julia followed him up the porch steps, noticing the care that had gone into the construction. The porch wrapped around one side of the house, with a rocking chair positioned to catch the evening breeze. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. A large main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a solid wooden table for dining, a stone fireplace, and several sturdy chairs. Bookshelves lined one wall, surprisingly full for a rancher's home. "You like to read," Julia observed. Matthew nodded. "Winter nights are long out here." He showed her the rest of the house, 2 bedrooms separated by a short hallway, a small space he used as an office, and a back porch that overlooked a garden plot. "This will be your room," he said, setting down her trunk in the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "I know it's not much, but it's fine," Julia interrupted, surprised to find she meant it. The room was clean and pleasant, with a comfortable-looking bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that faced east. Someone had placed a small vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, a welcoming touch she hadn't expected. "The flowers are nice," she said. "Mrs. Dawson from town brought them over yesterday," Matthew explained. "She helps with cleaning sometimes." Julia nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the reality of her situation. She was here in this stranger's home, expected to become his wife. What had seemed like a practical arrangement when conducted through letters now felt daunting. Matthew seemed to sense her unease. "Julia, I want to be clear about something. I know this is unusual. We don't know each other, not really. The agreement was for you to come here and, if we suited, to marry. But I meant what I said at the station. You have a choice." "What are you suggesting?" Julia asked cautiously. "I'm suggesting we take some time. Get to know each other before making any decisions about marriage." He leaned against the doorframe. "You can stay in this room, help around the ranch if you'd like, see if this life is something you could want." Relief flooded through her. "And if I decide it isn't, then I'll take you back to the station myself." His expression was solemn. "I want a partner, Julia, not someone who feels trapped." The knot of tension in her chest loosened slightly. "Thank you, that's very decent of you." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I try to be decent, at least. Now you must be hungry after your journey." Jasper's likely started dinner. He's a better cook than me, which isn't saying much, but the food's edible." Julia smiled for the first time since arriving. "I'm actually quite a good cook. Perhaps I could help." "I'd like that," Matthew said. "I'll let you get settled. Take your time." After he left, Julia sat on the edge of the bed and took a deep breath. This wasn't at all what she'd expected. The ranch was more modest, the landscape more beautiful, and Matthew Cole more considerate than she'd anticipated. She'd braced herself for a gruff, demanding man who would expect her to immediately fill the role of wife in all ways. Instead, he was offering her time and space to decide. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her dresses in the small wardrobe and placing her books on the bedside table. The last item in her trunk was a framed photograph of her parents, both gone now. She set it carefully beside the bed, wondering what they would think of her current situation. By the time she joined Matthew and Jasper in the main room, the aroma of cooking food filled the house. Jasper was tending to something in a pot over the fire, while Matthew set the table. "I hope you like stew, Miss Mason," Jasper said cheerfully. "It's not fancy, but it sticks to your ribs." "It smells wonderful," Julia replied. "And please call me Julia." The three of them settled around the table, and to Julia's surprise, the meal was comfortable rather than awkward. Jasper told stories of his early days in the territory, and Matthew occasionally added comments or corrections. They asked about her journey west, but didn't pry into her reasons for becoming a mail-order bride, which she appreciated. As they ate, Julia observed the easy camaraderie between the two men. It was clear they respected each other, and Jasper's obvious loyalty to Matthew spoke well of him as an employer and friend. After dinner, Jasper excused himself to check on a mare about to foal, leaving Julia alone with Matthew for the first time since arriving at the ranch. "He seems like a good man," Julia said, helping to clear the dishes. "The best," Matthew agreed. "Saved my life once during a blizzard, found me half frozen trying to get back to the ranch and somehow got us both home." Julia paused in her task. "That sounds frightening." "Winter in Idaho can be unforgiving." Matthew poured hot water into a basin for washing the dishes. "But it has its beauty too. The mountains covered in snow, the silence after a storm." They worked together cleaning up, falling into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. When the kitchen was tidy, Matthew gestured to the porch. "Would you like to sit outside for a while? The evenings are pleasant this time of year." Julia nodded, following him out. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. They sat in matching rocking chairs, the peaceful sounds of the ranch settling around them. "It's beautiful here," Julia admitted, watching the changing colors of the sunset. "It is." Matthew's voice held a note of contentment. "I never tire of this view." As darkness fell, the stars emerged, more stars than Julia had ever seen in Boston's light-polluted skies. She gasped softly at the sight. "The stars are incredible," she whispered. "I've never seen so many." Matthew smiled. "One of the benefits of all this space." He pointed upward. "That bright one there is the North Star, and there's the Big Dipper." They sat in companionable silence, watching the night sky deepen to velvet black. Julia felt some of the day's tension draining away. "Tomorrow I can show you around the ranch if you'd like," Matthew offered. "Help you get your bearings." "I'd like that," Julia said. She hesitated, then added, "I should tell you that I don't know much about ranching. I was a teacher in Boston." "I remember from your letters," Matthew replied. "Intelligence and a willingness to learn are more valuable than experience." "You can learn ranching. Not everyone can learn to think." The simple compliment warmed her unexpectedly. "It's getting late," Matthew said, standing. "You must be tired after your journey." Julia nodded, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. "Yes, I should get some rest." He walked her to her bedroom door. "Good night, Julia. I'm glad you decided to stay even if it's just for now." "Good night, Matthew." Alone in her room, Julia changed into her nightgown and climbed into the surprisingly comfortable bed. Through the window, she could see the stars and a sliver of moon. So different from Boston, where her small apartment had looked out on another brick building. She thought about the day's events, her near departure, Matthew's unexpected response, and the cautious truce they seemed to have established. He was nothing like she'd imagined from his letters, which had been polite but somewhat formal. In person, there was a depth to him she hadn't anticipated, a quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. Whether she would stay remained an open question. But as Julia drifted into sleep, she acknowledged to herself that, at least for now, she was curious to learn more about Matthew Cole and the life he'd built in this wild, beautiful country. Morning came early at the Double C. Julia woke to the sounds of activity outside her window, men's voices, the whinny of horses, the distant lowing of cattle. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day rushed back, and she sat up, taking in her new surroundings in the clear light of dawn. She dressed quickly in one of her simpler dresses, a practical blue cotton that wouldn't show dirt easily, and stepped out to find the main room empty, but a coffee pot bubbling on the stove. A note on the table in Matthew's surprisingly neat handwriting informed her that he and Jasper were in the barn, and she should help herself to breakfast. Julia poured herself coffee and found bread, butter, and preserves in a small pantry. She was finishing her simple meal when the door opened and Matthew entered, his shirt damp with sweat, smelling of hay and horses. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat. "Did you sleep well?" "Surprisingly so," Julia admitted. "I thought I might lie awake worrying, but the air here, it's different somehow." Matthew smiled. "Clean. That's what you're noticing. No coal smoke, no crowded streets." He poured himself coffee. "I've got morning chores to finish, but after that I thought I might show you around as promised." "I'd like that. Is there anything I can help with now?" He seemed surprised by the offer. "Do you know how to collect eggs?" "I grew up visiting my grandparents' farm in Vermont," Julia said. "I'm not completely city-bred." Matthew nodded approvingly. "The hen house is behind the garden. There's a basket on the hook outside." Julia finished her coffee and headed outside, squinting in the bright morning sunshine. She found the hen house easily enough and set about collecting the warm eggs, careful not to disturb the irritable hens too much. By the time she returned to the house with a dozen eggs, she felt a small sense of accomplishment. Matthew had finished his chores and cleaned up, his hair damp from washing. "Good haul," he commented, looking at the eggs. "Your hens are productive," Julia replied, "and only one tried to peck me." "That would be old Bessie. Mean as a snake, but lays the biggest eggs." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his serious face. Ready for that tour? They started with the immediate surroundings: the garden where Matthew grew vegetables, the smokehouse, the root cellar dug into the hillside. He showed her the barn with its stalls for horses, the tack room with saddles and bridles hanging neatly on hooks, the corral where several horses grazed. "That's Midnight," Matthew said, pointing to a sleek black gelding who trotted to the fence when he called. "Best cow horse I've ever had. And the bay mare is Penny. She's gentle enough for you to ride if you're interested." "I've ridden before," Julia said, "though it's been some years. It's like most things comes back to you." Matthew offered an apple to Midnight, who took it delicately from his palm. "We'll get you on Penny soon. Can't get around the ranch without a horse." They continued the tour, with Matthew explaining the rhythms of ranch life: the calving in spring, moving the herd to summer pasture, the fall roundup and drive to the railhead, the preparations for winter. He showed her the creek that provided water, the meadows where the cattle grazed, and the distant line of trees that marked the boundary of his property. "It's larger than I imagined," Julia remarked as they walked back toward the house. "Not compared to some," Matthew replied, "but enough to keep me busy." As they approached the house, a wagon appeared on the road heading their way. "Looks like we have visitors," Matthew said, shading his eyes. "That's Sarah Dawson's wagon." Julia felt a flutter of nervousness at the prospect of meeting someone new. The wagon rolled into the yard, driven by a middle-aged woman with a kind face framed by gray, streaked brown hair. Beside her sat a younger woman who bore a strong resemblance, clearly her daughter. "Matthew Cole, you didn't tell me your bride had arrived." The older woman called as she brought the wagon to a halt. "Jasper rode by our place this morning and let it slip." Matthew helped the women down from the wagon. "Sarah, this is Miss Julia Mason from Boston. Julia, this is Mrs. Sarah Dawson and her daughter Rachel. Please call me Sarah, Mrs. Dawson said warmly, taking Julia's hands in hers. "We're not formal out here. It's so wonderful to meet you." When Matthew wrote to that mail order service, we all had our fingers crossed he'd find someone special. Julia blushed, unsure how to respond. "It's nice to meet you too." "We've brought some things to welcome you," Rachel said, gesturing to the back of the wagon where several parcels were visible. "Just some preserves, fresh bread, and a few other items to make the place more homey." "That's very kind," Julia said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Nonsense," Sarah dismissed. "That's what neighbors do out here. We all have to look out for each other." Matthew helped unload the parcels, and soon they were all seated around the kitchen table, drinking coffee and eating slices of Sarah's fresh bread with butter and honey. "So tell us about yourself, Julia," Sarah urged. Matthew's letters were frustratingly vague about his bride-to-be. Julia glanced at Matthew, who gave a slight nod of encouragement. "I was a teacher in Boston," she explained. "I taught at a girls' school until it closed last year due to funding problems." "A teacher? How wonderful!" Sarah exclaimed. "We're desperate for qualified teachers out here. Our last one left after just one winter claimed the cold was too much for her constitution." "Mother," Rachel admonished. "Julia just arrived. Don't go trying to recruit her for the schoolhouse before she's even settled in." "I'm just saying it's fortunate," Sarah replied unapologetically. "And what made you decide to become a mail-order bride, dear, if you don't mind my asking?" Julia hesitated. It was a personal question, but she sensed no malice behind it, just genuine curiosity. "After losing my position, I found it difficult to secure another. Boston has many qualified teachers and without family connections." She paused. "When I saw Mr. Cole's advertisement, it seemed like an opportunity for a new beginning." Sarah nodded sympathetically. "It takes courage to travel so far to marry a stranger, but Matthew's one of the good ones, I assure you." Julia noticed Matthew shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Actually, Mrs. Dawson, Sarah, we haven't yet. That is, we're taking some time to become acquainted before making any decisions." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise, but she recovered quickly. "Well, that's sensible, I suppose, though quite unusual for mail-order arrangements." "It seemed the right approach," Matthew said firmly. Of course," Sarah smiled. "Well, Julia, regardless of the outcome, please know you're welcome in Challies. We have a small community, but a warm one. Church services are on Sundays, and we have a ladies' aid society that meets on Wednesday afternoons." "Thank you," Julia said. "I'd like to attend both." The conversation continued pleasantly, with Sarah sharing news and gossip about the town and its inhabitants. Julia found herself warming to the friendly woman and her quiet daughter. It was the first time since leaving Boston that she'd had female company, and she hadn't realized how much she'd missed it. After about an hour, Sarah announced they should be going. "I've left my husband to mind the store, and heaven knows what state it will be in if I don't return soon. He's a dear man but has no head for organization." As they prepared to leave, Sarah took Julia aside. "I'm staying at the Dawson General Store in town on Main Street. If you need anything, advice, companionship, or just a woman to talk to, please come see me." "Thank you," Julia said sincerely. "I appreciate that more than I can say." After the Dawsons departed, Matthew helped Julia carry the gifts into the house. "Sarah's a good woman," he said as they unpacked jars of preserves, a loaf of fresh bread, and a handmade quilt. "Talks more than any three people combined, but her heart's in the right place." Julia smiled. "I liked her, and Rachel seems sweet." "She is, engaged to the blacksmith's son. Wedding's next month." Matthew examined a jar of peach preserves. "Sarah's the unofficial welcoming committee for Challies. If she approves of you, which she clearly does, the rest of the town will follow suit. Even though I'm not officially your bride." Julia asked, curious about how their unusual arrangement would be received. Matthew set down the jar and looked at her directly. "People will talk, Julia. That's the nature of small towns. But anyone who matters will respect our decision to proceed carefully." Julia nodded, grateful for his understanding. "It's just that I've always been proper. The idea of living here unchaperoned with a man I'm not married to in Boston, it would be scandalous." "This isn't Boston," Matthew reminded her gently. "Out here, practicality often trumps propriety. But if it makes you more comfortable, we can tell people we're formally engaged, just delaying the wedding until you've adjusted to life here." The suggestion made sense, and Julia felt relieved. "That might be easier to explain. Thank you." "You don't need to thank me for treating you with basic decency, Julia." The simple statement, delivered without any expectation of praise, touched her. In her experience, men often did expect gratitude for showing the most minimal consideration. "Perhaps not," she agreed. "But I appreciate it nonetheless." Later that afternoon, true to his word, Matthew helped Julia saddle Penny for her first ride around the ranch. The bay mare proved as gentle as promised, and though Julia was rusty, her childhood riding lessons came back to her quickly enough. They rode along the creek, through meadows dotted with wildflowers, and up to a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the surrounding countryside. Julia felt a growing appreciation for the beauty of this wild land, so different from the crowded streets and manicured parks of Boston. "What do you think?" Matthew asked as they paused on the ridge, letting the horses rest. Julia took in the panorama before her, the mountains in the distance, the valley with its patchwork of green pastures, the ribbon of creek winding through it all, and the small cluster of buildings that made up the double C. "It's magnificent," she admitted. "I've never seen anything like it." Matthew nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "First time I saw this view, I knew this was where I wanted to build my ranch. Something about it felt like home." "How did you end up in Idaho Territory?" Julia asked. "You mentioned coming from Missouri after the war, but not much else." A shadow passed over Matthew's face. "Not much to tell. I fought for the Union, came home to find my family's farm in ruins, decided there wasn't anything keeping me there anymore, so I headed west like so many others." Julia sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. "And Jasper? How did you meet him?" "Card game and boys," Matthew said with a slight smile. "He was down on his luck, lost his horse betting on the wrong hand. I needed help starting the ranch and offered him a job. Been together ever since." As the sun began to lower in the sky, they turned back toward the ranch. The ride home was peaceful, with Matthew pointing out various plants and wildlife along the way. Julia found herself relaxing in his company, their conversation flowing more easily than she would have expected. Back at the ranch, Jasper had prepared a simple but hearty dinner. The three of them ate together, and Julia found herself laughing at Jasper's colorful stories about local characters and the early days of the ranch. After dinner, when Jasper had retired to his small cabin near the barn, Julia and Matthew again sat on the porch. The evening ritual already felt familiar, though this was only her second night at the Double C. "You did well today," Matthew commented. "Not everyone takes to ranch life so quickly." "I haven't done much yet," Julia demurred. "Collected a few eggs and stayed on a very gentle horse." "You met Sarah Dawson without running for the hills," Matthew countered with a hint of humor. "That alone shows remarkable fortitude," Julia laughed. "She's a bit overwhelming but kind." "That she is." Matthew leaned back in his chair. "Tomorrow I need to ride out to check on the North pasture herd. Would you like to come along? It's a longer ride, but the country up there is worth seeing." "I'd like that," Julia said, surprised by how much she meant it. She was sore from today's ride, but the prospect of seeing more of the ranch and spending more time with Matthew appealed to her. They fell into comfortable silence, watching as the first stars appeared overhead. Julia found herself stealing glances at Matthew's profile in the fading light. There was something compelling about him, a quiet strength that she found reassuring rather than intimidating. "May I ask you something personal?" she ventured. Matthew turned to her, his expression curious. "You may ask. I might not answer." "Your advertisement for a mail-order bride, it was very practical. You listed the qualities you were looking for: educated, healthy, willing to work hard, but you never mentioned anything about wanting companionship or—" She hesitated. "Love." Matthew was quiet for so long that Julia thought he might not answer. "I didn't think it right to promise something I wasn't sure I could deliver," he finally said. "Practical needs I understand. The rest—" He shrugged. Seemed presumptuous to expect. The honest answer revealed more about Matthew Cole than perhaps he intended. Julia sensed that behind his reserved exterior was a man who had known disappointment, who had learned to keep his expectations modest. "And what about you?" he asked, turning the question around. "Your letters were similarly practical. A teaching position lost, a desire for a fresh start. But nothing about what you hope to find in a husband beyond security." Julia considered her response carefully. "I suppose I thought those hopes too personal to entrust to paper and a stranger. And now—" His eyes met hers in the gathering darkness. "Now you're becoming less of a stranger," she said softly. "But I'm still learning what to hope for." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Matthew stood. "We should get some rest if we're riding out tomorrow." Julia nodded, suddenly aware of how intimate their conversation had become. "Good night, Matthew." "Good night, Julia." As she prepared for bed that night, Julia reflected on the day's events. The ranch was starting to feel less foreign and Matthew less like a stranger. She wasn't ready to call it home, wasn't ready to commit to becoming Matthew's wife, but for the first time since arriving, she could imagine it. Could picture herself building a life here, alongside this quiet, thoughtful man who was showing her his world with such patient care. It was too soon for conclusions. But as she drifted off to sleep, Julia acknowledged that staying on the train would have been the easier choice, but perhaps not the better one. The morning dawned clear and bright, perfect for the longer ride Matthew had planned. Julia dressed in her most practical outfit, a skirt she'd modified for riding and a simple blouse, and joined Matthew and Jasper for a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, bacon, and strong coffee. "North pasture's a good 2 hours each way," Jasper informed her as they ate. "Boss wants to check on that new bull we moved up there last week. Ornery creature but good bloodlines." "Will you be coming with us?" Julia asked. Jasper shook his head. "Someone's got to stay and mind things here. Besides, I promised Ed Miller I'd help him repair his hay baler today. After breakfast, Matthew helped Julia saddle Penny while he prepared midnight. He'd packed food for their midday meal in saddlebags, along with canteens of water. "The ride gets steeper toward the end," he warned as they set out. "If it's too much, we can turn back." "I'll be fine," Julia assured him, determined not to show weakness. Her muscles were sore from the previous day's riding, but not unbearably so. They rode north, following the creek for several miles before turning east into more rugged country. Matthew kept the pace moderate, clearly mindful of Julia's limited experience. The landscape changed as they rode, becoming more dramatic rocky outcroppings, stands of pine trees, and meadows bursting with late summer wildflowers. Matthew pointed out various landmarks along the way, a distinctive rock formation he called Eagle's Perch, an aspen grove that blazed gold in autumn, a secluded pond where deer came to drink at dawn and dusk. His knowledge of the land was intimate, born of years of careful observation. "How much of this is your property?" Julia asked as they paused to rest the horses near a clear stream. "About half of what you've seen so far," Matthew replied. "The rest is open range or government land that I have grazing rights to. That ridge marks my northern boundary." He pointed to a distant line of hills. After a short rest, they continued, the trail gradually becoming steeper as they climbed into higher country. Julia's thighs burned with the effort, but she was determined not to complain. The views compensated for the discomfort. Each rise they crested offered a more spectacular panorama than the last. Finally, they reached a high meadow ringed by pines. Cattle grazed peacefully across the expanse of grass, fat and content in the late summer abundance. "The north pasture," Matthew announced. "Best grazing on the ranch. I bring the herd up here for late summer, then move them down before the first snow." They dismounted, and Matthew tied the horses in the shade. Julia stretched her legs gratefully, wincing at the stiffness. "Sore?" Matthew asked, noticing her discomfort. "A bit," she admitted. "But it's worth it for this view." He nodded approvingly. "Let's check the herd, then we can eat." Julia followed Matthew as he moved among the cattle, his experienced eye assessing their condition. He seemed satisfied with what he saw, pausing occasionally to point out particular animals and explain their qualities. "That's him," Matthew said, indicating a massive black bull grazing apart from the others. "The new bull I wanted to check on. Paid more for him than I've ever spent on a single animal, but his calves should improve our whole herd." "He's impressive," Julia said, somewhat intimidated by the bull's size and the way he seemed to watch them with suspicious eyes. "That he is, and he knows it too." Matthew kept a respectful distance. Bulls can be unpredictable, especially new ones establishing their territory. "We'll give him plenty of space." They completed their inspection of the herd, then returned to the edge of the meadow where Matthew spread a blanket beneath a pine tree. From his saddlebags, he produced bread, cheese, dried fruit, and jerky, simple fare, but welcome after the long ride. As they ate, Julia found her gaze repeatedly drawn to the panoramic view, the ranch land spreading below them, the distant mountains, the vast blue sky overhead. "It never gets old, does it?" Matthew observed, following her gaze. "I can't imagine it would," Julia agreed. "In Boston, the only views are of other buildings, other people. Here it's just—" She gestured, unable to find adequate words. "Space to breathe," Matthew suggested. "Yes, exactly." They finished their meal and sat in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Julia was struck by how comfortable she felt with Matthew, despite having known him such a short time. His quiet presence was reassuring rather than awkward. "We should start back soon," Matthew said eventually, glancing at the sun's position. Don't want to be in the hills after dark." As they were packing up their things, a sudden commotion from the herd caught their attention. The cattle were moving restlessly, and several cows with calves began lowing in distress. Matthew tensed, his hand moving to the rifle in his saddle holster. Something spooking them. A moment later, Julia saw what had disturbed the cattle. A mountain lion, tawny and sleek, had emerged from the trees on the far side of the meadow. "Stay here," Matthew instructed, his voice low but firm. He withdrew the rifle and moved forward slowly. Julia's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold. The mountain lion was stalking toward a young calf that had become separated from its mother. The bull, however, had noticed the predator and was pawing the ground aggressively, positioning himself between the cat and the herd. Matthew raised his rifle, but before he could fire, the bull charged the mountain lion with surprising speed. The cat, recognizing the danger, abandoned its hunt and fled back into the trees, the bull pursuing for several yards before stopping triumphantly. "Well," Matthew said, lowering his rifle, "seems our new bull is earning his keep." The tension broken, they quickly finished packing and mounted their horses. The ride back was quieter, both of them tired from the day's exertions. But it was a comfortable silence, punctuated occasionally by observations about the scenery or the wildlife they spotted. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. Jasper emerged from the barn to greet them, taking the horses as they dismounted. "Everything all right up north?" he inquired. "More than all right," Matthew replied. "That new bull proved his worth today. Ran off a mountain lion that was after one of the calves. Did he now?" "Well, that almost makes his price tag worthwhile," Jasper said with a chuckle. Julia's legs nearly buckled when she dismounted, the long ride having taken its toll on her unused muscles. Matthew steadied her with a hand at her elbow. "You did well today," he said quietly, for her ears alone. Most city folk wouldn't have made that ride without complaint. The simple praise warmed her unexpectedly. "Thank you for taking me. It was worth every ache." They shared a smile, a brief, private moment of connection before heading into the house together. After a hearty dinner, Julia excused herself early, her body demanding rest after the day's activities. In her room, she eased herself into bed, muscles protesting every movement. But despite the physical discomfort, she felt a deep contentment. The day had shown her another side of ranch life, the raw beauty of the land, the rhythm of the seasons, the delicate balance between the rancher and nature. And it had shown her another side of Matthew, his respect for the land, his knowledge, his quiet confidence in facing potential danger. Julia was beginning to understand what had drawn him to this place, what kept him here despite the hardships. There was a freedom here, a sense of possibility that Boston, for all its culture and civilization, had never offered her. As she drifted toward sleep, Julia realized she was no longer thinking about whether she would stay, but rather how she might fit into this new world. The shift had come gradually, almost without her noticing. But lying there, with the memory of the day's adventures fresh in her mind, Julia acknowledged that something fundamental had changed in her outlook. She wasn't ready to make any declarations to Matthew or to herself. But for the first time since arriving at the Double C, Julia allowed herself to imagine a future here. A future with Matthew Cole. The next few days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Julia rose early each morning, helping with breakfast and learning the daily routines of the ranch. Matthew showed her how to feed the chickens properly, gather eggs without getting pecked, and tend to the vegetable garden. In the afternoons, they rode out to different parts of the ranch, with Matthew explaining the operations and Julia absorbing everything eagerly. On the fourth day, Rain kept them close to the house. Julia used the opportunity to thoroughly clean the kitchen, reorganizing it in a way that made more sense to her. Matthew raised no objections when he found her elbow deep in soapy water, scrubbing years of accumulated grease from the stove. "This place could use a woman's touch," was all he said, before disappearing to the barn to work on mending tack. That evening, Julia found a small box on her bed, a gift from Matthew. Inside was a journal, bound in soft leather with a pencil attached. "I noticed you looking at the wildflowers yesterday," Matthew explained when she thanked him. "Thought you might like to sketch them or write down their names. Sarah Dawson knows most of them if you're interested." The thoughtful gift touched Julia deeply. It showed an attention to her interests that she hadn't expected. On Sunday morning, Matthew hitched the wagon to drive them into Challies for church services. Julia wore her best dress, a modest navy blue with white collar and cuffs, and a straw bonnet trimmed with ribbon. "You look very nice," Matthew said simply when she emerged from her room. Coming from his usually reserved lips, the compliment held special weight. The church in Challies was a small white painted building with a modest steeple. As they approached, Julia felt a flutter of nerves at the prospect of meeting the community en masse. Word of her arrival had clearly spread. She could feel curious eyes on her as Matthew helped her down from the wagon. Sarah Dawson materialized almost immediately, bustling over to greet them. "Julia, my dear, I'm so pleased you could join us today. Come, let me introduce you to everyone." What followed was a whirlwind of introductions: the pastor and his wife, the blacksmith and his family, the banker, the schoolteacher, an older woman who immediately questioned Julia about her teaching experience, and various ranchers and townspeople whose names Julia struggled to remember. Throughout it all, Matthew remained at her side, a steady presence that Julia found reassuring. When they entered the church, he guided her to a pew near the middle, nodding greeting to those around them. The service was simpler than what Julia was accustomed to in Boston, but the message was familiar: love, faith, community. She found comfort in the ritual, in the shared hymns and prayers. Looking around at the congregation, a mix of well-dressed townspeople and sunburned ranchers in their Sunday best, Julia felt a growing sense of belonging. After the service, Sarah insisted they join her family for Sunday dinner. "It's tradition," she explained, and a chance for Julia to meet more of the community in a relaxed setting. The Dawson home was attached to their general store, a comfortable two-story building with a spacious dining room that soon filled with guests. Julia found herself seated between Matthew and Rachel, with Sarah's husband Thomas at the head of the table. The conversation flowed easily, touching on local matters, the weather, and gentle inquiries about Julia's background. She noticed that everyone referred to her as Matthew's fiancée, and no one questioned the arrangement he had described, that they were taking time to become better acquainted before marrying. "When I came west as a bride 25 years ago, there was no taking time," Sarah reminisced as she served apple pie for dessert. "Thomas and I were married the day after I arrived, hardly knowing each other at all." "Times change, Mother," Rachel said with a smile. "Not everyone is as decisive as you." "It worked out well enough for us," Thomas Dawson commented, patting his wife's hand affectionately. "But I can see the wisdom in Matthew and Julia's approach." After dinner, while the men gathered on the porch to smoke and discuss cattle prices, the women cleared the table. Julia found herself working alongside Rachel, who proved to be less shy one-on-one. "How are you finding life at the Double C?" Rachel asked as they washed dishes. "Different from Boston," Julia admitted, "but in mostly good ways. There's a simplicity to it that I appreciate." Rachel nodded. "Matthew's well respected here, quiet but fair. Everyone was surprised when he sent for a mail-order bride. He's never shown much interest in the local girls. Julia wasn't sure how to respond to this, but Rachel continued. I think it's romantic in a way, to correspond with someone sight unseen and then meet for the first time, knowing you might spend your lives together. It's certainly unconventional, Julia said carefully. Life out here often is, Rachel replied with a smile. My Robert and I had a proper courtship. His father's blacksmith shop is next to our store, so we've known each other all our lives. But many matches here have unusual beginnings. By the time they left the Dawsons' home, the sun was lowering toward the mountains. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both Julia and Matthew absorbed in their own thoughts. Thank you for today, Julia said as they neared the ranch. It was nice to meet everyone. Matthew nodded. Challies is a good community. Small but decent people for the most part. Sarah mentioned a ladies' aid society that meets on Wednesdays. You should go if you'd like, Matthew encouraged. I can drive you into town. Thank you, I think I will. Julia hesitated, then added, Everyone referred to me as your fiancé. Matthew glanced at her. Is that all right? We discussed telling people we were engaged but delaying the wedding. I can correct the assumption if it makes you uncomfortable. No, it's fine, Julia assured him. It's easier than explaining our actual arrangement. I don't want to mislead anyone if I ultimately decide to leave. Matthew was silent for a moment. Do you think you will leave? The direct question caught Julia off guard. I don't know, she answered honestly. A week ago I was certain I would, now I'm less so. He nodded, accepting her uncertainty without pressing for more. Fair enough. As they reached the ranch, the setting sun bathed everything in golden light: the house, the barn, the surrounding hills. Julia was struck again by the beauty of this place, so different from anything she'd known before. That night, as she prepared for bed, Julia found herself thinking about the community she'd met in Challies. They had welcomed her warmly, accepting her as Matthew's future wife without question. The thought of disappointing them, of disappointing Matthew, weighed on her, but marriage was too serious a commitment to enter from a sense of obligation. If she stayed, it would need to be because she truly wanted this life, this place, this man. The question was no longer whether she could adapt to ranch life. She was already doing that, more easily than she'd expected. The real question was whether what she felt for Matthew Cole was enough to build a marriage upon. Respect, certainly. Friendship, growing daily. Attraction. Julia blushed in the darkness at the admission, even to herself. Yes, there was attraction. But was that enough? Her parents had shared a deep love. She'd grown up witnessing their affection, their partnership, their unwavering commitment to each other. It was the standard by which she measured marriage, perhaps unfairly. Matthew was a good man, honorable, kind in his quiet way, respectful of her choices. But his reserve made it difficult to know his heart. Did he feel anything beyond practical consideration for her? Did she want him to? Julia sighed, turning over in bed. These questions had no easy answers. All she could do was continue as they had been, getting to know each other day by day, learning the rhythms of ranch life and waiting for clarity to come. The following Wednesday, true to his word, Matthew drove Julia into town for the Ladies' Aid Society meeting. Held in the church's small meeting room, the gathering brought together women from Challies and the surrounding ranches to work on charitable projects while catching up on news and gossip. Sarah Dawson welcomed Julia warmly, introducing her to those she hadn't met after church on Sunday. The women were working on quilts for families in need, and Julia was quickly set up with needle and thread to help with the stitching. As they worked, conversation flowed around her, talk of children and husbands, recipes and remedies, local events and distant news from the larger world. Julia mostly listened, absorbing the dynamics of the group and the community they represented. Julia was a teacher in Boston, Sarah informed the group. Miss Phillips has been saying for years she needs an assistant at the school. Miss Phillips, the stern-faced schoolteacher Julia had met at church, looked up with interest. Is that so? What grades did you teach, Miss Mason? All ages, from young children learning their letters to older girls preparing for finishing school, Julia replied. I particularly enjoyed teaching literature and mathematics. Miss Phillips considered this information. Our school is much humbler, one room, all ages together. But I could certainly use help, especially with the younger children. Perhaps you might consider assisting a day or two each week, once you're settled, of course. The offer caught Julia by surprise. I would enjoy that, actually, if Matthew doesn't need me at the ranch. Nonsense, Sarah interjected. Matthew Cole can spare his bride for a worthy cause. Besides, the school only meets Monday through Thursday. You'd still have long weekends for ranch duties. Julia made no promises but said she would discuss it with Matthew. The possibility of teaching again, even part-time, lifted her spirits. It would be a way to contribute to the community and maintain a part of her identity separate from the ranch. As the meeting wound down, one of the younger women, Emily, the doctor's wife, approached Julia. A few of us are planning a welcome dinner for you and Matthew this Saturday, she said. Nothing formal, just a chance to properly welcome you to Challies. That's very kind, Julia replied, touched by the gesture. I'm sure Matthew and I would be delighted to attend. When Matthew picked her up later that afternoon, Julia shared the news about both the teaching opportunity and the dinner invitation. Miss Phillips asked if I might assist at the school a few days each week, she explained as they drove back to the ranch. Once I'm settled. Matthew considered this. If it's something you'd like to do, I have no objection. The ranch keeps me busy, but Jasper and I managed before you came. We can certainly manage a few days without your help. His easy acceptance pleased her. Thank you. I've missed teaching, and it would be nice to contribute to the community. You don't need to thank me for allowing you to use your skills, Julia, Matthew said, echoing his earlier sentiment about basic decency. A good marriage is a partnership, not a master and servant arrangement. The casual mention of marriage, of their potential future together, sent a flutter through Julia's chest. They'd been careful to avoid the topic directly, maintaining the fiction of an engagement while both knew her decision remained unmade. About that, she said carefully. Emily Hunter has organized a welcome dinner for us this Saturday. I hope that's all right. I accepted for both of us without checking first. Matthew nodded. That's fine. The Hunters are good people. David's the closest thing to a doctor we have in these parts, trained back east before coming west for his wife's health. Everyone has been very welcoming, Julia observed. It's not what I expected. What did you expect? Julia considered the question. Suspicion, perhaps, or judgment. I'm a stranger, an Easterner with no knowledge of ranch life, arriving to marry a man I'd never met. Challies isn't so large that we can afford to be unwelcoming, Matthew said. New settlers, especially women, are valuable additions. Besides, he added with a slight smile, they're all curious about what kind of woman would agree to marry a confirmed bachelor like myself. And what kind of woman would that be? Julia asked, curious about his perception of her. Matthew glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. A brave one. Independent-minded, someone willing to take risks for a chance at something better. The assessment warmed her. That's rather generous. Just accurate, he replied. The rest of the ride passed in comfortable conversation about the day's events. Julia found herself looking forward to Saturday's dinner, another opportunity to become part of this community that was beginning to feel less foreign with each passing day. Saturday evening found Julia and Matthew dressed in their best clothes, driving into town for the welcome dinner at the Hunter's home. Julia wore a dark green dress she'd saved for special occasions, with a cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother pinned at her throat. Matthew looked handsome in a clean white shirt and dark jacket, his usual work clothes exchanged for more formal attire. The Hunters lived in a comfortable house on the edge of town, larger than most in Challies, befitting the doctor's status. Emily Hunter greeted them at the door, elegant in a blue silk dress that spoke of Eastern refinement. "Welcome, welcome," she exclaimed, ushering them inside. "We're so pleased you could come." The front parlor was filled with familiar faces: the Dawsons, Miss Phillips, the pastor and his wife, the banker and several prominent ranchers with their spouses. Julia felt a momentary pang of nervousness, but Matthew's steady presence beside her was reassuring. The evening proceeded pleasantly, with good food and lively conversation. Julia found herself seated between David Hunter and Thomas Dawson at dinner, engaged in a fascinating discussion about the changes they'd seen in the territory over the years. "When I first arrived 15 years ago, Challies was hardly more than a trading post," David explained. "Now we've got a proper town, a church, a school, businesses. Progress comes slowly to the frontier, but it comes." Throughout the meal, Julia noticed how Matthew interacted with the other guests, reserved but not withdrawn, offering thoughtful comments when he spoke. She realized he was respected in this community not for being outspoken, but for his reliability and integrity. After dinner, the group moved back to the parlor for coffee and dessert. The conversation turned to Julia and Matthew's courtship, with good-natured curiosity about their correspondence. "What first attracted you to Matthew's advertisement, Julia?" Sarah Dawson asked, her eyes twinkling with interest. Julia considered how to answer truthfully while maintaining the fiction of their engagement. "His honesty," she said finally. "Many of the advertisements I read were embellished, shall we say. Men describing their humble cabins as mansions or promising luxuries no frontier settlement could provide." Matthew's letter was straightforward about the challenges as well as the opportunities of ranch life. She glanced at Matthew, finding his eyes on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I appreciated his candor," she added. "It seemed a good foundation for a partnership." The answer seemed to satisfy the curious guests, and the conversation moved on to other topics. As the evening drew to a close, Julia found herself enjoying the sense of community, the easy laughter, the shared stories, the genuine welcome extended to her. On the ride home, beneath a canopy of stars, Julia broke the comfortable silence. "Thank you for tonight. It was lovely to feel included." Matthew nodded. "They're good people, and they clearly approve of you." "Is that important to you?" "Their approval," he considered the question. "Not in the way you might think. I don't need anyone's permission to live my life as I see fit. But in a community this small, where we depend on each other, good relationships matter." Julia understood what he meant. In Boston, one could live relatively anonymously, surrounded by thousands of strangers. Here, every connection was significant, every relationship potentially vital in times of need. "I enjoyed meeting everyone properly," she said. "Especially Dr. Hunter. It's reassuring to know there's medical care available, even if it's limited." Matthew glanced at her. "Are you concerned about that aspect of frontier life?" "The lack of amenities." "Not unduly," Julia replied honestly. "Every place has its advantages and disadvantages. Boston has hospitals and street lamps and indoor plumbing, but also crowding and noise and soot from the factories." She looked out at the vast, star-filled sky above them. "This has other compensations." When they reached the ranch, Matthew helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment, they stood close together in the moonlight, and Julia felt a sudden awareness of him not as her potential husband in some abstract sense, but as a man. A man whose touch sent unexpected warmth through her body. "Good night, Julia," he said softly, releasing her and stepping back. "Good night, Matthew." As she prepared for bed that night, Julia found herself thinking about that moment, the brief connection, the flutter of something more than friendship between them. In the 2 weeks she'd been at the Double C, Matthew had been unfailingly respectful, never presuming upon their arrangement or making her uncomfortable with unwanted advances. She appreciated his restraint, his determination to let her make her decision without pressure. But tonight, for the first time, Julia found herself wondering what it might be like if he did kiss her. If their relationship progressed beyond the careful friendship they'd established. The thought both thrilled and frightened her. She'd had limited experience with men in Boston, a few proper courtships that had never progressed beyond chaperoned outings and formal dinners. Nothing that had prepared her for the complex emotions she was beginning to feel toward Matthew Cole. The following days brought an unexpected development. A letter arrived from Boston from Helen Bradford, Julia's former colleague at the girls' school. Julia read it eagerly, hungry for news from her old life. The letter contained surprising information. The school was reopening under new management, and teaching positions were available. Helen wrote that she'd mentioned Julia to the new headmistress, who had expressed interest in hiring her if she wished to return east. "Is everything all right?" Matthew asked, noticing her distraction at dinner that evening. Julia hesitated, then decided honesty was best. "I received a letter from Boston today. The school where I taught is reopening, and there might be a position for me if I wanted to return." Matthew's expression remained carefully neutral. "I see. It's not that I'm planning to leave," Julia hastened to add. "Just, it was unexpected news." "Of course." Matthew set down his fork. "Julia, when you came here, I promised you'd always have a choice. That hasn't changed. If you want to return to Boston to teaching, I won't stand in your way." The calm statement belied the tension Julia could see in his shoulders, in the careful control of his voice. "I haven't decided anything," she said softly. "I only received the letter today," he nodded. "Take all the time you need. The offer to help at the school here still stands, if that would satisfy your desire to teach without leaving Challies." The conversation moved to other topics, but an undercurrent of tension remained. That night, instead of their usual time together on the porch, Matthew excused himself to check on a sick calf, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts. She took out Helen's letter, reading it again carefully. The opportunity was tempting in many ways, a return to familiar surroundings, to the profession she loved, to the security of knowing exactly what was expected of her. But as she thought about leaving the Double C, leaving Matthew, an unexpected ache formed in her chest. In just over 2 weeks, this place had begun to feel like home. The daily rhythms of ranch life, the beauty of the land, the small community of Challies all had worked their way into her heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. And Matthew with his quiet strength, his unwavering respect, his occasional glimpses of warmth and humor beneath the reserved exterior. The next morning, Julia rose early and found Matthew already at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reviewing figures in his ledger. He looked up when she entered, his expression guarded. "Good morning," she said, pouring herself coffee. "Morning." He closed the ledger. "Jasper and I need to ride out to fix some fencing on the east pasture today. We'll likely be gone until evening." Julia nodded, feeling the distance he was creating, giving her space perhaps, but also protecting himself from her potential departure. "Matthew," she said carefully, "about the letter, you don't owe me any explanations, Julia," he interrupted. "Your decision is your own." "I know that," she replied, a hint of frustration in her voice. "But I'd like to discuss it with you anyway. Your opinion matters to me." This seemed to surprise him. "My opinion?" "Yes." Julia sat across from him. "I came here expecting, I'm not sure what exactly. A practical arrangement, perhaps. Security in exchange for helping run your household. But these past weeks have been something more than that." Matthew's expression softened slightly. "They have for me as well." The simple admission encouraged her to continue. "The teaching position is tempting. I won't deny that. I miss teaching and Boston is familiar. But I've found things here I never expected: a community that's welcomed me, work that feels meaningful even when it's challenging, and—" she hesitated, "and a connection with you that I value more than I can express." Matthew was silent for a moment, his eyes searching hers. "What are you saying, Julia?" "I'm saying I don't want to return to Boston," she said firmly. "I want to stay here at the Double C, with you." The tension seemed to drain from Matthew's shoulders. "You're certain?" Julia nodded. "I am. I can teach here at the school with Miss Phillips. I can build a life here, a good one, if you still want me to stay." "I want that more than anything," Matthew said quietly, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I've been trying not to influence your decision, to give you the freedom to choose, but the thought of you leaving—" He shook his head. "It's been harder than I expected." The admission, so honest in its vulnerability, touched Julia deeply. "I'm not leaving," she assured him, squeezing his hand. "This is where I belong now." A smile, a real, unguarded smile, transformed Matthew's face. "Then there's something I should ask you properly." He stood, still holding her hand, and to Julia's surprise, knelt beside her chair. "Julia Mason, will you marry me? Not because of letters or advertisements or practical arrangements, but because I've come to care for you more than I thought possible in so short a time." Tears pricked Julia's eyes as she nodded. "Yes, Matthew Cole, I will marry you." He rose, drawing her to her feet and into his arms. When his lips finally met hers, Julia felt a sense of rightness, of coming home. This was where she belonged, in this wild, beautiful country, with this quiet, honorable man who had shown her a life she never knew she wanted. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the Challies church, with the entire community in attendance. Sarah Dawson had insisted on helping with the preparations, and under her expert guidance, the simple ceremony became a celebration the town would talk about for years. Julia wore a cream-colored dress that Sarah and Rachel had helped her make, with lace collar and cuffs and tiny pearls sewn along the bodice. Matthew, handsome in a new suit ordered from Boys, waited for her at the altar with an expression of quiet joy that warmed her heart. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, his voice carrying through the packed church, "we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." As Julia and Matthew exchanged their vows, she thought about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, from a newspaper advertisement to a train station where she'd almost fled, to finding a home and a love she'd never expected. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor concluded. "You may kiss your bride." Matthew's kiss was gentle but held a promise of passion that brought a blush to Julia's cheeks, as they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Cole. The applause and cheers washed over them, the approval and support of the community they would build their life within. The celebration afterward, held in the town square with tables laden with food contributed by every family in Challies, lasted well into the evening. There was dancing to fiddle music, speeches from well-wishers, and an abundance of good-natured teasing about their unconventional courtship. "I knew from the moment I saw you two together that you were meant for each other," Sarah declared, hugging Julia tightly. "Even if you both took some convincing." As twilight fell, Matthew and Julia said their goodbyes and drove back to the ranch, their ranch now, truly shared. Jasper had tactfully arranged to stay in town for the night, giving the newlyweds privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. The house had been transformed in their absence, fresh flowers in every room, the bed turned down with clean linens, a bottle of wine and 2 glasses waiting on the table. "Sarah's doing, I suspect," Matthew said with a smile, helping Julia down from the wagon. "She's been a good friend," Julia replied. "Everyone has been so kind." Matthew drew her into his arms. "They recognize what I recognized that first day at the station, that you belong here, Julia Cole." The sound of her new name sent a thrill through her. "I almost didn't get off that train," she reminded him. "Then I would have had to chase it all the way to Boise," Matthew said seriously. "Because something told me, even then, that letting you go would have been the biggest mistake of my life." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Julia marveled at how completely her life had changed in just over a month. From a lonely teacher in Boston to a rancher's wife in Idaho Territory, it seemed impossible, yet utterly right. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked, his voice soft in the darkness as he held her close. "That sometimes the best decisions are the ones that terrify us the most," Julia replied, nestling against his chest. "Getting off that train was the scariest thing I've ever done. And now it seems like the most natural thing in the world, being here with you." She pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "I'm home, Matthew, truly home." 1 year later, Julia stood on the porch of the Double C, watching as Matthew rode in from the north pasture, Jasper at his side. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the yard, and a crisp breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. So much had changed in a year. The ranch had prospered under their joint care, Matthew managing the cattle and land, Julia keeping meticulous books and overseeing improvements to the house and garden. 3 days each week, she assisted Miss Phillips at the Challey School, finding fulfillment in teaching the frontier children whose eagerness to learn matched her passion for education. But the greatest change was the one Julia carried within her, the child that would arrive with the first snows of winter. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, feeling the baby's movements as she watched her husband approach. Matthew dismounted with his usual grace, handing the reins to Jasper before striding toward the house. His face lit up when he saw her waiting, a transformation that still amazed Julia after a year of marriage. The reserved man she'd met at the train station now smiled freely, at least in her presence. "How are my girls today?" he asked, climbing the porch steps to kiss her. They had taken to calling the baby she, though they wouldn't know until the birth. "We're well," Julia replied, leaning into his embrace. "Though your daughter seems determined to practice her riding skills on my ribs." Matthew laughed, placing his hand beside hers to feel the movement. "That's my girl," he said softly, "strong like her mother." They went inside together, where Julia had dinner warming on the stove, a hearty stew and fresh bread she'd baked that morning. These domestic rituals had become precious to her, not burdens as she'd once feared they might be. There was satisfaction in caring for her home, her husband, their future child. After dinner, they sat on the porch as they had so many evenings before, wrapped in a blanket against the autumn chill. The stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, more brilliant than any Julia had seen in Boston. "I had a letter from Boston today," Julia said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Helen Bradford, my friend from the school, is getting married in the spring." "That's good news," Matthew replied. "Will you miss attending?" Julia considered the question. "A little, perhaps." but I wouldn't trade places with her for anything. She took Matthew's hand, placing it over her belly where their child grew. Everything I want is right here. Matthew's arm tightened around her shoulders. Do you ever regret it, not going back to Boston when you had the chance? It was a question he rarely asked, though Julia suspected it occasionally troubled him, the fear that she might someday wish for her old life, for the comforts and conveniences of the city. Never, she said firmly. Not for a moment. The woman who almost stayed on that train didn't know what she wanted, didn't know what happiness could be. She turned to face him, her hand cupping his cheek. But I know now. This ranch, this community, this life with you, it's everything I never knew I needed. Matthew kissed her then, tender and passionate at once. I thank God every day that you changed your mind at that station, he murmured against her lips. Julia smiled, remembering his words that had changed her fate. Then don't get off the train. I thank God every day that you gave me the choice, she replied, and that I found the courage to stay. As night settled fully over the double C, Julia Cole, once Julia Mason of Boston, once a mail-order bride who had nearly fled, sat contentedly in the arms of her husband, watching the stars and feeling her baby move within her. The life she had chosen, so different from anything she had imagined, had brought her a joy she hadn't known was possible. Sometimes, she reflected, the most meaningful journeys were those that began with uncertainty, with fear, with a step into the unknown. Her journey had started on a train platform in Challis, Idaho Territory, when a quiet rancher named Matthew Cole had offered her a choice, and she, against all expectations, had chosen to stay. It was the best decision she had ever made. 5 years later, the Double C had grown and prospered. What had once been a modest cattle operation was now one of the most successful ranches in the region. The house had expanded too. Matthew had added rooms as their family grew, with skilled help from neighbors during raising parties that combined hard work with celebration. Julia stood at the garden gate, watching as Matthew taught their son James, now 4 years old, to ride his pony. The boy sat tall in the small saddle, his face a miniature version of his father's, serious with concentration as he followed Matthew's instructions. Nearby, their 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth played in the dirt, happily arranging pebbles in patterns only she understood. Julia's hand rested on her belly, where their third child, another boy, she suspected would arrive in the summer. "Mama, look," James called, his serious expression breaking into a wide grin as he successfully guided the pony in a circle. "I'm doing it." "Wonderful, darling," Julia called back, her heart swelling with pride and love. Matthew looked over at her, his smile reflecting her own joy. In these 5 years, the quiet rancher she'd married had blossomed into an affectionate husband and doting father, though he maintained his reserved manner with most others. It was as if his capacity for love, once carefully guarded, had found its full expression in their family. Jasper appeared from the barn, silver-haired now but still spry. "Mail's here, madam," he announced, handing Julia several letters. "Looks like one from that Boston friend of yours." "Thank you, Jasper." Julia took the letters, recognizing Helen's handwriting on one envelope. The older man stooped to pick up Elizabeth, who immediately began playing with the buttons on his shirt. "Come on, little miss. Let's go see if we can find those kittens in the barn while your mama reads her mail." Julia sat on the garden bench to read Helen's letter, which contained news of Boston and mutual acquaintances. It always felt strange to read about her former life, like hearing stories about a different person altogether. "Good news?" Matthew asked, approaching with James proudly walking beside him, leading the pony. "Helen's had a baby girl," Julia replied, And she says the new headmistress at the school is making all sorts of changes, not all for the better, in her opinion. Matthew smiled, sitting beside her with James clambering into his lap. Do you ever miss it? Teaching full-time? Julia considered the question. Her work at the Challies school had expanded over the years. She now taught 3 full days each week, focusing on the older students while Miss Phillips worked with the younger ones. It was a satisfying arrangement that allowed her to maintain her professional identity while still having time for her family and the ranch. Sometimes I miss certain aspects, she admitted, but I wouldn't trade what I have now for anything. Besides, she added with a smile, between the school and these little ones, I still get plenty of teaching experience. James, apparently feeling ignored, tugged at his father's sleeve. Papa, can we show Mama how I can trot, if Mama wants to watch? Matthew replied, glancing at Julia. Of course I do, she assured her son. Show me everything you've learned. As Matthew helped James back onto the pony and led them to the corral for the demonstration, Julia reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The hesitant woman who had nearly stayed on that train was now firmly rooted in this place. In this family, she and Matthew had created together. The Double C was home in every sense of the word, the place where she had discovered her strength, where she had found love, where she was raising her children amid the beauty and challenges of frontier life. That evening, after the children were asleep, Julia and Matthew sat on the porch as had become their custom. The ritual had remained unchanged through the years, though now they often had little ones on their laps or playing at their feet. Tonight, with the children dreaming in their beds, it was just the two of them beneath the vast Idaho sky. I've been thinking, Matthew said, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. A dangerous pastime, Julia teased, resting her head on his shoulder. He chuckled, his arm tightening around her. I've been thinking about that day at the station, about how close we came to never having this our family, our life together. Julia nodded, understanding his reflection. It frightens me sometimes, how easily it might have gone differently. Do you remember what I said to you when you told me you changed your mind? Then don't get off the train, Julia quoted softly. I remember thinking how unexpected it was that most men would have tried to convince me to stay. Matthew was quiet for a moment. I didn't want to start our life together with persuasion or manipulation. I wanted it to be your choice, freely made. It was the right approach, Julia assured him. If you'd pressured me, I would have resented it. By offering me freedom, you gave me the chance to recognize what I truly wanted. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge. I have something for you, Matthew said eventually, reaching into his pocket. An early anniversary gift. He handed her a small box, and Julia opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of their family, Matthew, Julia, James, and Elizabeth, taken on their last trip to Boise. It's beautiful, she breathed, running her finger over the engraving on the back. For the woman who chose to stay. 5 years ago, you made me the happiest man in Idaho Territory, Matthew said, his voice husky with emotion. Every day since has been a blessing I never expected to receive. Julia leaned up to kiss him, tears of happiness pricking her eyes. And every day, I thank God for giving me the courage to get off that train. As the evening deepened around them, Julia reflected on the journey that had brought her here from a mail-order bride who changed her mind at the station to a woman deeply in love with her husband, her children, and the life they had built together on the Double C Ranch in Challies, Idaho. Some might call it fate or destiny, but Julia knew it had been a choice, perhaps the most important choice of her life. A choice that had led to a happiness greater than anything she could have imagined that day at the station when a quiet rancher named Matthew Cole had said, then don't get off the train. And she, against all expectations, perhaps even against all reason, had chosen to stay.